So for our second puzzle this week, what we're going to take about 10 to 20 minutes to do is to review some of the main terms from chapter 4. The reading and the quiz and puzzle from this week and last week are a little wonky because I actually assigned you to read chapter 4 last week. That's because I didn't want you to have to read 2 chapters this week. But instead of having a bazillion questions on your quiz from last week to cover both chapters, I'm incorporating some of the content from chapter 4 to the quiz this week. So it'll still be really easy to follow along with the quiz through chapter 4 and chapter 5 using your book. All of it occurs in order. And before you take that quiz, we'll be reviewing some of that content that you hopefully read last week in this puzzle. And so all of this is going to essentially just continue on with what we started with last week, and to refresh our memory and get our head in the right space to talk about this classical conditioning stuff again, we're going to look at an example of classical conditioning with a short clip from The Office. This is a great clip that I love to use. It's really easy to identify the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, neutral stimulus, and then in turn the conditioned stimulus and response. But the clip has largely been taken off of YouTube, and so when we show this clip, you'll see that it's kind of embedded in like a classroom clip that students made. So just disregard that. It's really just a 30-second clip that I'm looking for. And so let's take a look at it. So as you're watching this 30-second clip, try to, in your head, identify what all the stimuli and responses are.
Let's reboot again. Okay, Dwight, do you want an outlet? What do you think? What? One outlet. Okay. Outlet? Sure. What are you doing? All right. What? I don't know. Oh, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden.
Okay, so hopefully you could hear that all right through the computer audio. So in that short clip from The Office, we see that Jim is doing a classical conditioning prank to Dwight, essentially. So let's go through and try to identify all of the different stimuli and responses. So last week we started with identifying the unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response first. And so what was the unconditioned stimulus that led to the unconditioned response initially? Well, the unconditioned stimulus might have been relatively hard to identify, but it's being offered an Altoid. And so if we look at the unconditioned response, which was, of course, putting out a hand for the Altoid, then we can kind of work backwards and figure out what the stimulus was. And so Dwight puts out his hand for the Altoid every time that Jim offers him one, right? This happens automatically. Dwight wasn't trained to do this. He just does it because he likes Altoids. And so naturally, every time that Jim offers him an Altoid, he puts out his hand to take one and accepts it, right? So the unconditioned stimulus here is being offered the Altoid with the unconditioned response of Dwight putting his hand out. Now, what was the neutral stimulus that was then paired with the unconditioned stimulus? Well, that was the startup chime from the computer. So again, this is neutral. It has nothing to do with the Altoid on its own. It doesn't elicit a response or any type of reaction from Dwight typically. And so the startup stimulus begins as a neutral, the startup chime begins as a neutral stimulus. Then over multiple trials, we see that the startup chime is paired with Jim offering him an Altoid. And so this happens several times. Then after the conditioning takes place, the conditioned stimulus then is the startup chime. So again, the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are always going to be the same thing by definition. This neutral stimulus has just turned into a conditioned stimulus, now that this conditioning has occurred. And then, of course, the response now is that every time Dwight hears the startup chime, he puts his hand out for an Altoid. So hopefully now we can remember all of that practice that we did last week and move on to some other principles having to do with classical conditioning in Chapter 4 that describe different situations that classical conditioning might occur in and some things that might affect how classical conditioning occurs. So let's go back to the diagram that we started with last week. We looked at this and we actually broke this down without using words into particular parts of this process just by the nature of the diagram itself. But each one of these phases actually has a name that we learned this week through the reading. And so before conditioning, that's not anything, that's just how things occur naturally. But during conditioning, while the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus are being paired together in time, we call this the acquisition phase. And so conditioning is being acquisition. So the development and strengthening of a conditioned response through repeated pairings of the neutral and unconditioned stimulus. So that should be a pretty easy one to take over. So after this acquisition phase and classical conditioning has occurred, and now we have this conditioned stimulus and conditioned response, does classical conditioning last forever? So will that conditioned stimulus always elicit the conditioned response? So once you achieve the conditioning, it just persists forever. Well, hopefully you remember from your reading last week that there's a lot of instances where the classical conditioning does not last forever. And so this might have to do with the salience of the stimuli being used. And so if you're using very strong or powerful stimuli, it might take fewer trials to achieve conditioning, and it might last for longer. So say that you have been conditioned to have a fear response to car horns. So you got in a car wreck one time. At this time that you had to impact another driver, both you and the other driver were laying on their car horns, okay? And so you were classically conditioned, so the car horn now elicits fear from you because the car wreck initially elicited fear. So something as strong as that, a fear response to something like that was really strong, like a car wreck, that probably only has to happen one time, and that'll probably persist and last for a very, very long time. But something else, a less powerful stimuli, take for instance the classic example of Pavlov and his dog and the metronome. Something like that, a metronome isn't a very powerful stimuli, and food is just kind of relative. I guess it depends how hungry they are, right? And so that might not last forever. So regardless of how strong the stimuli is, once you have achieved classical conditioning, if the conditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus are no longer paired together, which you don't usually have to do after it's been classically conditioned, if they're not paired together for a long time and the stimuli wasn't particularly strong in the first place, we might have this thing called extinction occur. And that's basically where the classical conditioning goes away. So that conditioned stimulus now no longer elicits the conditioned response, and it essentially goes back to being neutral. And so that tone or the metronome that was paired with the food no longer makes the dog drool, or the doorbell no longer makes the dog bark. The conditioning can just go away after a while in some cases, depending on how strong the stimulus is. We call this extinction. And so this is when the response is weakened so that you no longer get that conditioned response, or just completely eliminated. So it's essentially the opposite of acquisition. It's when the CS is repeatedly presented in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus. So it's essentially the reverse of conditioning, and through that we see the conditioned response disappear. Sometimes those classical conditioned responses will just go away and then miraculously reappear randomly. And so we call this spontaneous recovery. This is the reappearance of a conditioned response to a conditioned stimulus following a period of extinction. And so spontaneous recovery could happen for a number of reasons. It could just be random, and the animal or the human is just trying to see and testing it out to see if that stimulus still is paired with the other one. Times of high stress or high emotion might lead to spontaneous recovery, or the presentation of a novel stimulus could lead to spontaneous recovery. Essentially, something changing usually might make a conditioned response that faded away and got extinguished reappear. It might not reappear forever. It might just come back for 1 or 2 times, but we do see that sometimes it magically reappears after extinction through this process of spontaneous recovery. So once conditioned, and let's say we have this conditioned response that's persisting, it's not going away or being extinguished, will only that exact conditioned stimulus that was used during acquisition and during conditioning elicit that conditioned response. So will it only be that exact doorbell chime that makes the dog bark? Or will it only be that exact metronome beat that makes the dog drool? Or will it only be that exact car horn that gives you a feeling of fear when you hear it? Well, no, generally we have some stimulus generalization. Generalization is one of those psychology words that Microsoft Word will always underline and tell you it doesn't exist. But I assure you it does exist in psychology, and we use it across a number of different realms. And in behaviorism, this means one thing spreading over to another very similar thing. And so stimulus generalization is when a stimulus similar to the conditioned stimulus also elicits that conditioned response. So perhaps you remember me bringing up poor little Albert last week. So John Watson, remember, did an experiment with little Albert where he classically conditioned him to be afraid of white rats. He did so by showing him a white rat, and then he went through a period of acquisition where every time he showed him, you can't see it from these old photos, these are actual photos, by the way, but there's a little white rat in his lap, and he's like very happy about it, nothing's wrong, kind of likes that little white rat. And then during this period of acquisition, they play a really loud, like banging noise every time the white rat is around. Okay, and so he gets classically conditioned to be upset and fear the white rat because it gets associated with this really loud, unpleasant noise. So we see here at the last one, this poor little baby Albert, and this long gone psychology experiment is now classically conditioned. And so is it only going to be that one rat that he's afraid of and doesn't like? Well, they actually first tested out this theory with little Albert, and he did have some stimulus generalization to other types of animals. And so little Albert, through this conditioning, also became afraid of both white bunnies and brown bunnies, other small white animals, or other small animals in general. So essentially, the stimulus generalization generalized to all sorts of small white animals and small brown animals. So poor little Albert just had a real fear of basically all small animals. Interestingly enough, it also generalized to a white Santa beard. So anything that was white and fluffy, because the unconditioned or the conditioned stimulus was a white fluffy rat, it generalized to everything that was white and fluffy. So we even began to fear Santa Claus. But obviously there's got to be some type of line where this generalization stops. And so not everything that's white and not everything that's fluffy, or not all animals or something like that, elicit this conditioned fear. So when they presented little Albert with a larger brown dog, so it was neither small nor fluffy really, nor white, he did not have the conditioned fear response to a larger brown dog. And so we call this stimulus discrimination. And so this is where the conditioned response is not elicited by a stimulus because it's just a little too different. And so there is a line where something becomes too different for that conditioning to generalize to it. So it's when a response is elicited by one, but not another stimulus. So we can apply these two concepts to some of the examples that we covered last week as well. So if you remember the dog and the doorbell example, remember that the dog was conditioned to bark at the doorbell because he associated the doorbell with people entering and coming into the house. Well, true story, this dog that lives at my parents' house, who still have a landline and an old phone, this dog generalizes the doorbell to the ringing of their old landline phone. So every time someone calls the house, the dog barks as if someone was ringing the doorbell. This dog also will bark at doorbells on the TV. And so even when it's not coming through the same speaker and the tone and the rhythm is slightly different, the dog will bark at most doorbell sounds on the TV. And so we see that the response to the one specific doorbell is generalized to specific types of phones, and then also slightly different doorbells that are coming from a different source from the TV. But there is some discrimination here. Luckily, a dog doesn't bark at everything, so it does not generalize to, say, a cell phone ring. And so the cell phone ring sounds much different than this landline ring. It doesn't really sound like a ring at all. It's more like a tone or a tune. And so the dog doesn't choose to bark at that. And the dog doesn't bark at the kitchen timer or oven timer or anything of that nature also, which might sound similar to the landline phone or the doorbell, but it obviously doesn't sound similar enough. So there's a line somewhere between the similarity here between the landline and the TV doorbells and the cell phone rings and the kitchen timers. So we do have some stimulus generalization and discrimination both there from our main example last week. So very similar to generalization is higher order conditioning. And essentially this is just 2 rounds of conditioning. So it occurs when a stimulus that is associated with a conditioned stimulus also becomes a conditioned stimulus. So when a conditioned stimulus is paired with a neutral stimulus, and then conditioning now occurs for that neutral stimulus. So this will make more sense when we kind of break it down into the diagram. Essentially, one thing that was conditioned, and then a second round of conditioning occurs after that, in which another thing is associated with it. And so our normal classical conditioning example and diagram that we looked at last week looks very much like this, right? The unconditioned stimulus and response, then you pair it with a neutral stimulus, and then you end up with a conditioned stimulus and response. With higher order conditioning, you start with classical conditioning, and then you continue on. So you take that now conditioned stimulus, which elicits this conditioned response, and you then pair a new neutral stimulus with the conditioned stimulus. And so now this new neutral stimulus will elicit the conditioned response. And so essentially these just continue on. So you have one phase of normal typical classical conditioning, and then this conditioned stimulus can now serve as kind of like an unconditioned stimulus here, and it can now be paired with something neutral so that this response becomes associated. So let's look at the dog doorbell example again. So again, we end up with the conditioned stimulus being the doorbell and the dog barking, correct? So now with higher order conditioning, we can now associate the doorbell with something else. And so it's not going to be associated with something that's really similar. That would just essentially be stimulus generalization. Rather, we're pairing it with something else through conditioning. So we start with this doorbell and the dog barking, then say that every time the doorbell rings, I immediately yell coming afterwards, which is a pretty normal response so that you can let someone know that you're coming to the door and they don't ring it again to drive the dog crazy, right? So every time the doorbell rings, that gets paired with the term coming, and then the dog barks. So as an acquisition phase occurs here, Then you have some higher order conditioning to the word coming. So if you were to say coming in any other, maybe in a sentence or some other type of situation, the dog might just bark to that word on its own. And so again, essentially is taking a response that you conditioned and then using it to condition another stimulus. Preconditioning is similar to higher order conditioning. It's just where the order is slightly reversed. And so this is where the conditioning occurs before the classical conditioning occurs. So it's just two things that were already associated together, not necessarily similar, but associated together through because they occur together. So again, it's not necessarily two things that are similar to each other, like stimulus generalization, but rather they've just been paired together through classically conditioned before in time. And then once one of those stimuli gets paired with a response through classical conditioning, the respondent will usually respond to the already associated stimuli as well. So we covered some of the main terms in Chapter 4. There are some other terms that I'm not going to drone on with the Edpuzzle on. I think the book has relatively good explanations of these things like reevaluation for the unconditioned stimulus, blocking, overshadowing, and occasion setting. And so those are things that you should make sure that you pay attention to in the reading and ask any questions about them if you might have them. There are some terms from Chapter 4 and from Chapter 5 that I'm not actually concerned with, since I want to give you a heads up as you read through Chapter 5 and you study for your test, that you're not going to be asked, say, a short essay question on these terms or anything like that. So I'm not concerned with experimental neuroses. And then these three theories that we use to explain the conditioning behavior, not very concerned with them either. From Chapter 5, I am really concerned with the application of classical conditioning to specific instances like phobias. So you want to make sure that you read through and understand that. It's also really interesting. But this stuff, if you don't completely understand it in the reading, don't drive yourself crazy trying to go through it and make total sense of it. So that's just a heads up. Then you can continue on with Quiz 2, where we'll cover this information from Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 that I'm concerned with. And then you can go on to begin studying for your test. As always, let me know if you have any questions about the test. Look at your short essay questions in advance and ask any questions that you have. I'm also open to sending me drafts of your short essays if you'd like some feedback, but those have to be received before the weekend while I'm still in office hours.